Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about biomolecules. And these are things that you find in your food, right? So macromolecules or biomolecules are things like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. So they're terms that you've heard of before. Today we're going to review kind of what they are and what you use them for. We're also going to be looking at their molecular structure with the goal of being able to identify what kind of biomolecule you're looking at just by looking at the molecular structure. And that sounds really complicated, but it's actually not too bad once you get used to it. So those are two of the things we're going to be looking at. I'm going to break it down and do a presentation for each of the biomolecules, so it's a little bit shorter and you don't have to listen to me talk for that long. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and let me know. All right, so there's four major classes of macromolecules. These are organic compounds. They're found in all living things. They're super important. And the four major classes are going to be carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So we'll go through each of these, kind of what makes them unique, what similarities they have, why they're important. You need all four of these. There's no such thing as a zero carb diet. You would not be able to survive. You need those. You need all of these to be healthy and function properly. So all four classes are going to be essential building blocks of life. All four are going to contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids and carbohydrates are going to be made up solely of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, proteins and nucleic acids also contain additional elements. In particular, you have nitrogen and then some other elements added in, depending on what you're dealing with. So we're going to start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates' main function is going to be to supply energy. It is the preferred form of fast energy for most of your cell types or all of your cell types. Some parts of your body can use different forms of energy, but all of them like carbs, which is why we love carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, like I just said, are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Thus the carbohydrate. And it's usually going to be the base unit, that base sugar, is in a 1:2:1 ratio of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So one of those sugars is going to have that 1:2:1. For example, glucose is going to be C6H12O6. Now this, we're talking about a single ring carbohydrate or sugar. Sometimes when you start adding them together, that changes. So glucose is going to be the preferred reactant in aerobic cellular respiration. And we'll talk more about aerobic cellular respiration later in the year. But you'll notice that glucose is going to be the preferred start. And the big idea here is you use that glucose to create a whole bunch of ATP. And ATP is the kind of energy currency of your cells. It's how you get reactions to proceed. So in animals, the main function of carbohydrates is going to be energy. Carbohydrates are made up of monomers. So all of these are polymers made up of monomers. And those monomers, in the case of carbs or carbohydrates, are called monosaccharides or simple sugars. So here are some really common simple sugars. You have glucose, galactose, ribose. Notice that we have them in this kind of ring structure. This is shorthand. So you'll notice I don't see all that many carbons over here, but really anywhere where you have, let's see, this guy right here, this guy right here, this guy right here, this guy right here, these are all going to be carbons. Sorry, I'm not great at drawing on this. So anywhere where you have those lines meeting in these molecular diagrams would be a carbon. And remember, carbon needs to make 4 bonds to be happy. So this carbon here, you see 1, 2, 3 bonds. Well, the assumption is that fourth bond would be a hydrogen. So these are kind of shorthand molecular diagrams. Again, sorry, my drawing on here is not great. So if you have your ribose over here, this is 1 carbon, 2 carbons, 3 carbons, 4 carbons, 5 carbons. You always kind of start counting from the oxygen, and you'll see that this carbon over here has 1, 2, 3, 4. So that would be full. Its octet is full. It's made 4 bonds. So that's how you read those diagrams. Glucose, fructose, galactose, and ribose are going to be kind of common monosaccharides that you should be familiar with. Now, if you put 2 of those monosaccharides together, you get what's called a disaccharide. And these are also sugars that you are most likely familiar with. So glucose plus glucose. So if you have glucose 1 and glucose 2, you put them together, you're going to form a disaccharide of maltose. So if you combine glucose with galactose, you're going to get lactose. If you have glucose plus fructose, you get sucrose. And sucrose is actually table sugar. So lactose is the milk and sugar. Maltose is the milk and malt. The sugar and malt. But these are kind of the common disaccharides that we see. And then polysaccharides, so that poly means many, those are your complex carbohydrates. And these can function in energy storage, so things like starches in plants or glycogen if you're an animal. So plants store their carbohydrates in a polysaccharide called a starch. In animals, we actually will break those down and then rebuild them into something called glycogen. And that's going to be stored in your liver as well as in your muscles. If you're a plant, you also use those polysaccharides for structure. So cellulose is going to be an example of a structural component. So that's what cell walls are made of. Arthropods and fungus also have something called chitin. So I know it looks like chitin, but it's actually chitin. So yeah, there's lots of different ways that polysaccharides can be used, or at least there's 2 main ways that polysaccharides can be used in organisms. So here, this potato, you can see that's full of starches, and that's going to be energy storage. Here you see this lobster. The shell is made out of that chitin. Okay. Not all of those are going to be created equal. So amylose and amylopectin are examples of plant polysaccharides that are broken down relatively easily. Amylose is the starch that we're most familiar with, and we can break those down pretty easily for energy. Cellulose, however, which is found in cell walls, we do not have the enzymes to break it down. And so it comes out the same way it went in. That's fiber in your diet. So it is useful. It helps keep things moving in that large intestine, but you can't break it down for energy. And the animal polysaccharide, again, is going to be glycogen. And if you look at those structures, you can see that they're all made up of these long chains of sugars. But if you look at, say, amylose or amylopectin, you have these long chains. Amylopectin has a few side branches. Amylose is another long kind of curlicue strand, but there's not a lot of branching on those, which means that it's pretty easy for us to pluck off one at a time, but it's a slow release of energy. Whereas glycogen, the animal starch, you'll notice that it has all of this branching coming off of it, so there's lots of different points where you can pull the little sugars off when you need them. They're both really important for energy storage, but starches are what we would consider more slow release, whereas glycogen is more of a fast release. And this is a really good example of how structure relates to function. Glucose, you have 2 forms, the alpha and beta, and really it's all about where that hydroxide, that OH group, is attached. So here we see in alpha glucose, it's attached there, whereas in beta glucose, it's attached on the other side. So it's what we call an isomer. They have the same molecular formula, they're just arranged slightly differently. But we can digest starch, we cannot digest cellulose. So it really is going to have an impact on how it functions. All right, so that was a lot of information all at once. Take a break, summarize what you've learned, and then come on back and we'll talk about